Welcome to this video on exploring authentication and authorization in Node.js. After watching this video, you will be able to describe the need for authentication and how it validates a user's identity in Node.js, explain session-based authentication, including the creation, storage, and destruction of session IDs, and contrast token-based authentication and passwordless authentication, highlighting the use of JWTs and public and private key pairs. Imagine designing an e-commerce platform with Node.js, where users sign up and make purchases. However, you realize that the platform's authentication and authorization mechanisms are not robust enough, as user data may be at risk, making unauthorized access possible. This could lead to severe consequences, such as data breaches and loss of customers' trust. How can you avoid this situation? Learning about the concepts of authentication and authorization in Node.js is essential for securing user authentication, safeguarding sensitive data, and enhancing your app's reliability and user satisfaction. Let's start by looking at authentication. Authentication refers to verifying who a person claims to be by checking their credentials. This is a fundamental aspect of securing applications so that only authorized users have access to certain parts of the system. The application's backend is responsible for handling this verification process. Now, let's learn about the three popular authentication methods. Three popular authentication methods in Node.js include session-based, token-based, passwordless. Let's explore each of these in detail. Session-based authentication is one of the earliest methods. Here's how it works. Log in with your credentials, which are validated against a database that stores the accessible resources based on the session ID. If valid, the server creates a unique encrypted session ID, which is stored in the database and as a browser cookie. When you log out or after a certain period, the session ID is destroyed, logging you out from both the browser and the database. Now let's explore a code snippet demonstrating session-based authentication in an Express application. In this example, the code performs the following functions. It sets up an Express application and configures session management. Next, the code configures the Express session middleware with a secret key for encrypting the session data and other options like resave and save uninitialized. Then, it handles post requests for your login. If the provided username and passwords match, it stores your username in the session. Finally, the code checks if you are authenticated as a user. If authenticated, the application welcomes you. Otherwise, prompts you to log in. Now that you've learned about session-based authentication, let's move on to token-based security. Token-based security includes two key concepts: authentication and authorization. Authentication is when you provide credentials and receive a token that validates your user credentials. Authorization is when you use the token to access resources, ensuring the resource server knows which resources you're permitted to access. Tokens, often in the form of JSON Web Tokens, JWT, consist of three parts. Header contains the token type and the algorithm used. Payload includes user attributes, known as claims, such as permissions and expiration times. Signature ensures the token's integrity during transit. JWT, pronounced JWT and written as JWT, is an internet standard for creating signed JSON payload data. In token-based authentication, your browser requests access to a web application. The authentication server responds with an ID token, stored as a secure cookie by the client, which is sent to the web server providing authentication. Now that you understand token-based authentication, let's move on to token-based authorization. Token-based authorization occurs when a web application requests access to a protected resource, such as an API. During this process, the user authenticates with the authorization server, which then generates an access token that is sent back to the client and stored. With each HTTP request, the token is passed to the resource API server, carrying embedded permission details, eliminating the need to query the authorization server. Even if stolen, the token doesn't expose credentials due to encryption. Next, you'll see a token-based authentication example in an Express application. In this example, the code performs the following functions. First, the code configures an Express application with middleware, like body parser, to parse JSON requests. Then, the code handles post requests for user login. If credentials are valid, it generates a JOT or token containing the username. Checks for a JOT in the authorization header of incoming requests. If present, the code verifies the token and extracts the username to grant access. Next, let's look at passwordless authentication. Passwordless authentication eliminates the need for traditional passwords using methods like biometrics, magic links sent to your email, or one-time passcodes sent to your mobile device. This approach is often used in password recovery systems. It relies on public key and private key encryption. When you register, your device generates a private-public key pair linked to your identity. The public key is used to encrypt data and is accessible to anyone, while the private key, securely stored on your device, decrypts data. During sign-in, the app creates a login challenge, encrypts it with the public key, and decrypts it with your private key to authorize access. Next, you'll see how passwordless authentication is implemented in an Express application. In this example, the code performs the following functions. The code sets up an Express application with middleware to parse JSON requests or body parser. Then, it handles POST requests where users provide their email to request access, and then the code generates a 6-digit verification code and stores it in an in-memory object. Next, the code handles POST requests to verify the received code against the stored code. If matched, the code grants access to the user. Otherwise, it denies access. In this video, you learn that authentication confirms your identity using credentials by validating who you claim to be. Session-based authentication uses credentials to create a session ID stored in a database and the client's browser. When you log out, the session ID is destroyed. Token-based authentication uses access tokens, often JOTs, that get passed between server and client with the data that is passed between the two. Passwordless authentication uses public-private key pairs to encrypt and decrypt data passed between client and server without any password.